Thanks, Beth, and want to thank Talley and Meredith, whoever Meredith is too, for working with me on this. It's been really great to be a part of the gallery, and thanks everybody for coming and listening. I'm just going to talk somewhat briefly, kind of starting from the title of the show, Better Than Most, which is somewhat boastful. I think it's a pretty appropriate and well-suited title for this series of photographs. The photographs were all taken sort of on like different travels throughout Georgia and the Carolinas. Like Beth said, I'm currently a Georgia resident, and so I was going to a lot of livestock and agricultural shows. And this is something I did sort of growing up in Texas. It was just like an annual event that I went to these kinds of events, to be repetitive. And it was a really enjoyable and like familiar way to use my time when I was in a new and sort of unfamiliar environment. And I felt that this also gave me a nice glimpse into a new type of regionalism for me, that being of the Deep South, which is something that's very different than Texas, which contains its own kind of regionalism. And when I went to these different shows and competitions, I was really drawn towards like displays and symbols of value and the hierarchy system that exists in those types of displays. And so this could be from like ribbons to placards to barriers, and also from what I discovered, like gestures, something like this. Gestures and poses that contained a lot of meaning that was really mysterious for me, because as an outsider and not a member in these very small communities, I knew they contained a lot of meaning, but I thought they were beautiful just sort of in their ambiguous state. And so for instance, with this photograph over here, which is titled Winning Apples, when I went to this event, when I first came upon this scene, I sort of took the text like very literally as an adjective, and it's this really sort of beautiful display, and I was thinking in my head, like I thought the sign was sort of talking to me like, yes, these are some amazing looking apples. Like they probably are delicious. And then I quickly realized that this was just specifying the type of apple. And you can't really tell, but like this is sort of this four-tiered like pyramid display that's really tall. And there's like Granny Smiths and then something else on the other side. So it's not necessarily like these are the best apples that were brought to this show. This is just the best of the delicious apples. And I found that I had this really solitary moment of like comedy. I was thinking to myself, at some point in time, there was some very qualified person judging like all of the delicious apples that were brought in, like bushels of the same kind of apple, and there was some sort of guidelines or some sort of system set into place of how you would decide one bushel over the other bushel. And although that's not necessarily seen within the photograph, that's sort of my thought process about why I was interested in this particular scene. And then also there's this strange, like sort of stark or like aggressive red line that goes across the frame that's really a velvet rope, and which you really think of like these being reserved for celebrities or something like that. And when you come up to this, this display, this velvet rope is like beckoning you closer. It's very seductive. That's sort of what velvet ropes are meant to do. They bring you closer to something that's somewhat maybe better than you or a higher social status or something like that. And so you want to get closer to look at whatever the thing is that it's barricading, but it also keeps you at a certain distance. You definitely can't touch the apples. So I found that even more interesting. And I found that like the aesthetics of all of these situations, basically the forms of them all, were made that much more ambiguous and that much more beautiful when they're in this context of winning. And that's sort of what I've thought about when I went to all of these different places, is how those two things meet. And it's kind of what I'm interested in with all of them, and where they all started off with sort of in my mind. Do you guys have any questions? I know that's really short, but I just wanted to give you like a brief intro.
Did you stage that, or is that just a photograph?
It is just a photograph.
Okay. So why do you think they put the red and white mums there? And then they don't even grow delicious apples in Georgia. They're from Washington. Michigan or something. That's like,
I know nothing about like apple geography, but I gotta say, like,
they're displaying them and voting on them, but they don't even grow them there. So
no.
kind
And
of parroting all this.
no, and I think it's also the way that when I talked about being interested in the display of these things, there's the judging, there's the deliberation, and then there's the display of the winners, and there's never losers, but there's like winners and then like 8th place winners and then everything in between those 2 points. And in that in-between space is something I really find interesting too, and then just the face-off itself, like with the avocados, just the competition within the delicious apple variety or within the avocados. And so that, like I was saying, it's sort of this 2-part system. The competition side is very interesting, and then also the aesthetics of how people display things to bring you closer, to sort of seduce you into wanting to be interested in these things is what what I think is intriguing. So the mums were just something that was there at this show. They were in front of everything with the green astroturf and then the red and the white mum planters. That was just what was around everywhere. But there's a very particular, everything in the show has a very strategic sort of placement. So these were put next to the avocados because like these mums are sort of next to each other, like contrasting each other, but also are kind of buddies. And the avocados are sort of talking to each other, but they're competitive as well. So that's kind of the reason why those two are next to each other, but definitely singular images themselves.
Could you say anything about these two?
Yeah.
You see them, I don't know, somehow a little different from some of the other things, or not maybe exclusively.
Yeah, these two are titled Some Things Are Bleak, Post and Cage. And this was at 2 different cat shows that I went to. And they were like preliminary cat shows to the big national cat show that happens in Atlanta. So they were like small town cat shows. And I found that with these particular ones, the subjects or the characters of these little environments, when they were gone or missing, it sort of changed the read of the cage or the cat post without the cat in there. And it made them a little bit more mysterious as to what their purpose was. And I think it kind of gives you a bit more room to interpret what you're looking at. The cage is sort of sad and also like a prison, but it's also very beautiful and I found it somewhat reminiscent of some type of eroticism, because there's this like little feather in this black cage and you're like, what's going on in here? That's the way I came to it. And then with the pink post, that was at a different cat show, but I had already taken the empty cage photograph. And when I saw the lonely post, it gave me the same sort of feeling of like, what is this object, this little orphaned object without its user, without the cat? And I found that they accomplished that idea of like sadness, but also slight humor better when they were sort of paired next to each other. And that one has a little pink frame on it because I wanted it to feel a little chunkier and also to make it a bit more lighthearted, because it is somewhat of a melancholy photo. But whenever I can, I like to incorporate the frame as an object as much as possible, so I decided to paint that one pink. Any other questions?
I have a question. What is this lovely photo over here?
Well, which one, sir?
Yes, with the feathers of some.
That one is titled Indian Fantail, and that is a particular breed of pigeon. I went to a pigeon show in South Georgia, and pigeon shows I'd been to before, they have a bit more of a grander one at the Fort Worth stock shows, if you guys have ever been there. But the Indian Fantail is an odd pigeon because the fanning of the tail is actually like a mutation, and it's kind of the tail turned around 180 degrees, sort of. So instead of the tail going out backwards like a normal bird tail, it like sits on the top of the bird's head. So it serves no function, but it is just very lovely to look at. So these birds are basically bred for no function except to please, like the aesthetics or the form of the feathers are just meant to look really great. And so I found that just interesting enough in itself. And then a lot of the birds use their tail as sort of like shade and coverage, because why not? And so this one was just like very lonely and in a corner of a cage, and I felt that it was already mysterious and a nice shape in itself with the sort of organicness of the feathers and all the lines of the cage. And then it was also this mystery as to like, what is this thing in there and what is it doing? And it left a lot of room for interpretation.
Does that mean it doesn't fly?
I didn't see any fly. Maybe it could. A helicopter or something. I have no idea. But it didn't. They were encaged, all of them, yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Thanks, Meredith.